In the 1850s, there was bloodshed in the place we call Kansas. And this bloodshed was over whether the folks from Missouri could come in and bring in their tradition of owning other people as slaves. They thought that would be a great thing to do to expand what they wanted, but there were folks in Kansas who didn't like the idea, and other folks came across country to fight against it as well. The Browns and the Thompsons were two of the families that came west to fight against slavery, and fight they did. John Brown himself was there with some of his sons, and some of the Thompson family, like Henry Thompson, fought alongside him. And they fought with guns and with swords. In one of the infamous incidents, they took revenge on some pro-slavery folks who had supposedly murdered anti-slavery folks. Well, they went and killed them right back. And Henry Thompson was standing alongside John with a big old sword. Well, after that, John Brown took some of his sons and two of the Thompsons back to a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And they fought a terrible fight there, a doomed fight. The idea was they were trying to raise up escaped slaves and get them to fight back and join an army that didn't really exist. It was mostly something that John Brown dreamed of and hoped that would happen, or at least that it would stir up people enough that eventually the fight against slavery would turn into a war. In a way it did a couple of years later, and the Civil War occurred. Oh, but after the Civil War, the West grew and things happened out here on the West Coast. And less than 10 years after the Civil War, folks came to this place now that's called Pasadena. It was the Indiana colony at first, and that group that called themselves the Indiana colony included some ex-soldiers from the Civil War, men who had fought in the Union Army and the Union Navy, fought against slavery, fought for the Union. Well, later, Henry Thompson brought his wife out here, Ruth Brown Thompson. Now, Ruth, she liked taking care of people. In fact, when Henry was injured during the fighting in Kansas, she talked her father out of taking him to Harper's Ferry, and that's why he survived. Well, when they got to Pasadena, Ruth made a living for the two of them by taking care of people who were sick, ones who came to Pasadena on doctor's orders with tuberculosis. And they came here for the better air and the warmer climate. And she set up a camp down in the Arroyo Seco where they could stay away from other people and live someplace partly outdoors, partly in tents, where they could regain their health. Some of them did, but the ones who were just too sick passed away. Well, her brother Jason Brown came to Pasadena as well, and then brother Owen. And they formed a little community up there in the mountains above Altadena, where Jason and Owen homesteaded a nice little place. They thought they would do they tried farming, they tried ranching, but the fact was that it was a little too dry and a little too far away from everything. So they didn't make a really good living, but they loved that place up in the hills. You see, Jason wasn't really fond of living in a city. So, to make extra money, Jason worked for Thaddeus Lowe up on Mount Lowe as a zookeeper. Back when Thaddeus Lowe had his big resort up there, he had a zoo as one of the attractions, and Jason worked for that. But Owen, well, he'd lived through the Harper's Ferry attack because he was in one of the groups that was outside the main fighting. He was supposed to help gather weapons and horses and men, but they didn't show up. And so after the attack failed, Jason was one of the ones who wasn't there at all, and Owen was one who managed to escape. There was a price on his head from the Virginia government, so he never enlisted in the Civil War because he thought that if he was captured, they'd just kill him outright. Jason wasn't the one in the fighting for the most part, although he had been a little bit in Kansas. He was not one of the sword wielders. He was not one of the ones at Harper's Ferry. Oh, but Owen was in the thick of things, and everybody knew him. So it was that even in Pasadena, years later, in the late 1880s, it was Owen that everybody remembered as being the warrior. And it was Owen who, when he died, had the biggest funeral in Pasadena for many, many years. 2,000 people showed up for Owen Brown's funeral because they remembered him as John Brown's son, a warrior who'd fought in Kansas and at the edge of the Harper's Ferry battles. Oh, the people of Pasadena were so saddened by that. Owen was buried up in Altadena under a big old rock, rather than in the cemetery that was just opened. Jason, well, he retired and he left the Pasadena area and went back to Ohio. But Ruth and Henry stayed here. They loved Pasadena, and even when, well, Ruth got really too old to run her convalescent camp, their daughter, who was a local school teacher now, she helped them get by. But it was tough. They had a little house toward the west end of Pasadena, but they had a little mortgage on it, and Ruth and Henry were both sick, and they had doctor bills to pay. Well, that was when the local newspaper stepped in, and they said to the people of Pasadena, "This is Ruth Brown, daughter of John Brown, the one who tried to free the slaves in Virginia and who helped start the fighting that ended up freeing them. This is Henry Thompson, a man who fought for freedom in Kansas with a sword in his hand. Are you people going to let them sit there and owe money and fail to own their house?" Well, the African American community in Pasadena stepped up, and they staged a show, a fundraiser show, and they took donations, and they gave the money that was raised from that show and those donations to Ruth Brown Thompson and said, "Here, your father did a lot for us. Your brothers and your husband did a lot for us. We need to show our gratitude, to thank you, to help you. Please accept this money." And Ruth did accept the money. And they paid the doctor bills, and they paid off the little mortgage. So it was that a few years later, when both Ruth and Henry passed away, they were not in debt. They didn't leave their daughter bills to pay. But the African American community of Pasadena that raised the money to help them remembered the Brown family, remembered the Thompson family, and remembered the battles to be free, because that's what it was all about. The freedom of those who would have been enslaved, the freedom of people to choose, to vote for what they wanted. And in Kansas, what they wanted was a land with no slavery. And that's a story of the children of John Brown.